Welcome to our deep dive into effective information organization techniques in the age of noise. This book is all about, tackling that information overload we're all facing every day, and we're going to try to pull out the key strategies specifically for you, the listener, so that you can kind of get a handle on things.
You know, it's interesting. Even though this book is titled Here At Siwo, Chung Sewol on Share, I just said .pdf, it might sound a little bit intimidating, but it really comes down to some practical advice, incredibly practical. And it starts by acknowledging, something I think we can all relate to. We're drowning in information.
Oh, absolutely. Between our smartphones and social media and, the constant barrage of news and notifications, it's no wonder we all feel a little overwhelmed. I mean, in fact, the author even admits to struggling with this themselves. They share this story about how they track their own smartphone usage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and realize they were spending an average of, get this, 4 hours a day.
4 hours?
Yeah, 4 hours a day on stuff that wasn't even work-related.
4 hours? That's a huge wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
And it really highlights a point that I think the book makes early on, which is this. It isn't just about feeling scattered or, a little disorganized. This information overload can really prevent us from achieving our goals.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If you're constantly distracted and struggling to kind of filter out the noise, how are you supposed to focus on the things that truly matter?
Yeah. It's like trying to have a conversation in the middle of a rock concert. There's something important being said, but you just can't hear it
Right.
over all the noise. And I think that's where this idea of information fatigue comes in.
Yeah. And the book really gets into how this fatigue can lead us to do something that seems helpful on the surface, but it actually makes the problem even worse. We start hoarding information just in case we might need it later.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
I am so guilty of this. My bookmarks are like a digital graveyard of articles I'm never going to read. It's like it's almost like a fear of missing out,
I know.
Like, what if I delete this and need it later?
Yeah. And it's such a common trap. And it actually ties into something that, we hear about a lot, the Pareto principle, or as some people call it, the 80-20 rule.
Right.
And in this context, it means that 80% of the value we get from information, it actually comes from just 20% of what we consume.
Wow.
So all those saved articles, those bookmarked websites, all the notes we take, we're probably only ever going to use a tiny fraction of it.
So we're spending all this time and energy gathering information, but most of it is basically just digital clutter, taking up space on our devices, but also in our minds.
Yeah. And the book digs into the psychology behind why we do this.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how good it feels to just scroll through social media, right? You get this little dopamine hit every time you see a new post, a new notification. And the book argues that this feeling, it can actually work against us. It makes us crave more and more information, even when it's not actually useful.
So how do we break free from this cycle, this information hoarding and dopamine chasing? It seems like the first step is recognizing that more information doesn't always equal more knowledge or better decisions.
You got it. And the book has this really simple but powerful solution. I love this one. Define your endpoint before you even start consuming information.
So what does that look like in practice? How do you do that?
Well, it's about asking yourself two key questions. Why am I doing this? To clarify your purpose. And then what do I want to achieve? So you can define your goal. And by having that clear intention from the start, it can really help you kind of filter out the noise and focus on what's relevant.
I can see how that would make a difference, because instead of passively absorbing information, we're actively seeking it out with a purpose in mind. And it's interesting because the book actually connects this idea to something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah. Hermann Ebbinghaus was the psychologist. He studied memory and forgetting. And what he found was that we forget things incredibly quickly if we don't engage with them actively.
Right.
So having that clear purpose can actually help us encode that information more deeply. And then we're more likely to remember it and use it later.
Okay, so we've talked about this problem of information overload and how important it is to really be intentional about what we consume. But what about the information we do decide to keep?
Yeah.
How do we organize it in a way that makes sense? How do we make sure that it's useful?
Well, the book advocates for a less is more approach. It's about embracing this Japanese concept of koryu kallai rai, which means that value actually comes from scarcity.
That's a really interesting concept. How does that apply to information management? What does that mean?
Well, think about it this way. If we try to hold on to every single piece of information we come across, nothing really stands out.
Right.
But if we're selective and we only keep the essential stuff, those key insights, they have more room to breathe, to really make an impact.
So it's about being discerning with our information, just like a curator carefully selects pieces for an art exhibit. And I know the book actually uses Apple products as an example of this principle in action.
Right. I mean, Apple is known for their minimalist design and that intuitive user experience. They don't overwhelm you with all kinds of options, or features. They focus on the essentials, and I think that's what makes their products so appealing, so useful.
And they also compare it to a Japanese rock garden. Or, those gardens are so serene, so contemplative. And it's because they embrace emptiness.
Yeah.
The absence of clutter actually forces you to focus on those key elements, and it makes the experience so much more profound.
That's what we're trying to do here with information. We're trying to create those mental spaces where the essential can stand out and make a real impact. So how do we do that? Well, the book offers a framework for effective information input. And it all starts with something they call the input-output rule.
Okay, I like it. I'm intrigued. What is the input-output rule? How can they use it?
It's really simple, actually.
Yeah.
It's about determining your output goal before you consume the information. So, for example, let's say you're working on a presentation. You have to think about what you want your audience to take away from it. And then you tailor your research around that specific objective.
So it's like working backwards from your desired outcome.
You got it.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Instead of just gathering information randomly, we're being strategic about what we consume and how we use it. What are some other strategies the book suggests?
Active curation is another big one. Don't just passively collect information. You have to decide what to discard. Be ruthless. Remember, value comes from scarcity.
It's like Marie Kondo for your digital life.
Yeah.
But instead of asking if it sparks joy, we're asking if it serves our purpose.
That's a great way to put it. And here's a tip that might surprise you. You got to go beyond the desk.
Okay.
Get out in the world.
Yeah.
The book actually encourages you to supplement your research with real-world observations, insights.
It's the idea of Genba, Genbutsu, Genjitsu, the three realities, right? Pizza, we have to get out there and experience things firsthand to get the full picture.
There you go. And, the book has this example about someone who finds this amazing apartment online.
Oh, yeah.
But then they go visit it in person. And it's a total letdown.
Huge disappointment.
Right.
It's not what they expected at all.
Sometimes the most valuable information, it comes from direct experience, not just what we read online.
Yeah, absolutely. The book also talks about listening widely, gathering those different perspectives, especially from people outside our usual circles.
It's so easy to get, stuck in that echo chamber
right.
where everyone agrees with us. But those diverse viewpoints, they can really challenge our assumptions, broaden our understanding.
And that ties into another key strategy, right? Being aware of our own biases.
Yeah.
Our cognitive biases. We all have them.
We do.
And they can influence how we process information without us even realizing it. One bias the book highlights is confirmation bias, which is our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Confirmation bias is a sneaky one.
I know. And the book uses this example of the debates around lockdown measures during COVID. People on both sides, they often only looked for information that supported their existing views, and it just made it so hard to even have a productive conversation.
Yeah. It's a great example of how our biases can lead us astray.
Yeah.
Especially today, it's so easy to find information that already confirms what we believe.
Yeah.
So we've covered how to be more purposeful about our information intake and how important it is to look for diverse perspectives. But what about organizing and filtering that information once we have it?
That's a great question. Because even if we're being selective about what we're consuming, it can still feel overwhelming.
Absolutely.
To manage all of that effectively. So what does the book recommend? What can we do?
That's where things get really interesting. And we're gonna dive into that right after this. All right, so we've been talking about being, really intentional with our information intake. But even when we're careful about what we let in, it can still pile up. So how do we make sure we're not just replacing digital hoarding with like physical stacks of paper and notebooks all over the place.
Right. It's like out of the frying pan into the fire. We're just trading one kind of clutter for another.
Exactly. And that's where the book's advice on organizing and filtering really comes in. And I think, one of the most impactful suggestions is surprisingly simple. Ready for this?
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Organize information as you get it, not after.
Okay.
So think about it like preparing a basket before you go apple picking.
Yeah.
If you have a system in place from the start, you're not going to end up with a big jumbled mess at the end of the day.
So instead of trying to sort through everything later, we're setting ourselves up for success right from the beginning.
That's the idea.
I like that. Makes it seem a lot less daunting. But what about those of us who, aren't naturally organized? Are there any tools or strategies that can help, get us on the right track?
Oh, absolutely. The book recommends leveraging what they call frameworks. And these are basically, you can think about them as pre-existing structures for categorizing information.
Yeah.
Analyzing it.
Okay.
So they're like mental filing cabinets.
I like that.
With, all these clearly labeled drawers for different topics or projects.
Okay. So if I'm researching a new marketing campaign, I might have a framework with sections for market research, competitor analysis, target audience, things like that.
Yeah.
That way, all the information I gather can just be, neatly filed away in the right spot.
Exactly. Frameworks, they help you avoid redundancy, and they make it so much easier to find what you need when you need it. No more digging through piles of notes or scrolling endlessly through digital files.
That sounds like a dream.
And here's another tip that I found particularly insightful. Seek out what the book calls distant information.
Distant information. Okay, now I'm really curious. What does that even mean?
So it means, exploring information outside your immediate field or your area of expertise. It might not seem directly relevant now, but it could be incredibly valuable down the road.
Okay, I see.
The book gives this fascinating example of how the rise of smartphones has influenced the snack food market.
Oh, that's interesting. I would have never connected those two things.
Yeah.
What's the connection there?
Well, because people are often using their phones while they're snacking, right? Food packaging has evolved to prioritize single-hand use. You can open it with one hand, you can eat it easily. It's a subtle shift, but it's significant. And you might not even notice it if you were really focused on trends within the snack food industry itself.
That's a great example of how these seemingly unrelated trends can actually intersect.
Absolutely.
Influence each other. It makes me realize how important it is to stay curious, keep our minds open to new information, even if it doesn't seem relevant, to our work or our personal lives at that moment.
I mean, you never know where those unexpected connections might lead you.
Right.
Now, when you're feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, the book offers this simple but effective rule. The rule of 3.
Okay, I like it. I am all about simplifying things. So tell me more about this rule of 3.
So it's all about distilling information down to its essence. When you're faced with, a ton of data or research, you force yourself to identify the 3 key takeaways.
Oh.
That's it. 3.
Just 3. Okay.
It's a really quick way to cut through the clutter. Focus on what's truly important.
And there's actually some science behind this too, right? I mean, our brains are wired to remember things in chunks, and 3 to 5 items seem to be that sweet spot for optimal retention.
Exactly. So the rule of 3, it helps us work with those natural cognitive limitations, not against them. And the book also encourages you, trust your intuition in this process. You've already done the work of defining your goals, filtering the information. Now it's about trusting your gut to identify the most salient points.
So it's not just about blindly following a formula. It's about combining that structured approach with our own kind of innate sense of what's important.
You got it.
Okay. I like that. It feels empowering, like we're in the driver's seat, taking control of the information instead of letting it control us.
Precisely. Now, effective information management isn't just about collecting and organizing. It's also about keeping things fresh.
Oh, okay.
And the author actually emphasizes the importance of, regularly reviewing and discarding outdated information.
That makes sense. I mean, the information landscape is constantly changing, so clinging to outdated data that can actually be detrimental. It's like trying to navigate with an old map, you know? You might end up getting lost.
Exactly.
Or miss out on some important landmarks. But how do we actually make time for this kind of information maintenance? It seems like, just another thing to add to our to-do list,
Yeah.
which is already probably overflowing.
Well, the author has a clever system for this. They set aside the last day of each month as their information discarding day, and they actually mark it on their calendar to make sure it happens.
Oh, I admire their discipline. It really highlights that information management is an ongoing process, right? Not just a one-time task.
Right.
But what about those information traps we talked about earlier? Are there any other, red flags we should be on the lookout for to make sure we're not, fall into those traps?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the biggest traps, I think, is mistaking opinions for facts. Just because someone says something confidently, doesn't make it true. We need to be really critical consumers of information, especially online, where, anyone can be an expert these days.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's an expert on the internet. And the book also warns about, being wary of data that seems too good to be true, or might have been selectively presented to support a certain agenda.
Right.
We have to remember there's often more to the story than what we initially see.
There's always more to the story. And be careful not to fall into the trap of false correlations.
Yeah.
Just because two things happen to occur together, it doesn't mean that one caused the other. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
It's like that funny example in the book about the correlation between Nicolas Cage films and swimming pool drownings.
Oh, yeah. Classic example.
Right. Just because those two things trend together doesn't mean one is causing the other.
Exactly. You know? We need to use our critical thinking skills. Always question the source. Consider those alternative explanations. And look for evidence, real evidence, to support those claims.
So we've talked about, purposeful information consumption, effective organization, avoiding those common pitfalls. But what about the output side of things? How do we effectively share all these valuable insights that we've, so carefully gathered and organized? After all, information isn't really useful unless we can communicate it in a way that makes an impact.
Right. That is a fantastic question. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into next.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how to gather information, filter it, organize it. But now what about sharing it? It's one thing to have your head full of all these insights, but if you can't communicate them effectively, then the value is kind of lost, right?
It's true. It's like having a treasure chest full of gold, but no way to spend it.
Exactly. And that's where the book's advice on information output comes in. And I think you'll find some of these tips pretty surprising.
Okay. I'm ready to be surprised. What's the first step? How do we make sure our information output is actually impactful?
Well, the book actually advises us to slow down.
Oh.
Yeah. Don't rush into sharing the information. Take some time to process it. Think about who you're sharing it with. Structure your thoughts.
That's interesting. It seems like we're always being told to, move fast and break things in today's world. But maybe a little bit of thoughtful reflection before we hit send or publish, it could go a long way.
Absolutely. It's about being intentional, strategic, just like we were talking about with information input. And speaking of strategy, one of the most powerful ways to make your information memorable, turn it into a story.
Oh, I love that. Stories are so engaging. They help us connect with information. On an emotional level, it's not just about the facts and figures. It's about weaving those details into a narrative that really resonates with people.
Yeah. And the book even gives this example of a top salesman. He wasn't a particularly gifted speaker, but he was a master storyteller. And that's what made him so successful, that ability to connect with people through narrative.
So instead of just bombarding our audience with data points and statistics, we should be thinking about how we can frame that information as a compelling story.
Yeah, exactly. It's like giving them a mental hook to hang those facts and figures on so that they're more likely to remember it and be moved by it.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so along with storytelling, what else does the book recommend?
Well, they also emphasize the importance of leveraging patterns. Think about using established communication templates, frameworks to structure your output.
Okay, so it's like we're providing a familiar roadmap for the audience. They can follow along more easily because the structure is predictable, and then that allows them to just focus on the content itself.
Exactly. And this leads us to one of the most important principles for effective output. And it's really a theme that runs throughout the entire book, embracing simplicity.
Yes. That Japanese concept of less is more. We want to make sure the information we're sharing is clear, concise, and easy to understand.
Exactly. The book reminds us that even Socrates, the great philosopher, he valued simplicity in thought. And they have this really practical tip for achieving this. Aim for one key message per output unit.
Okay, so one key message per sentence, one key message per paragraph, one key message per slide, if you're doing a presentation. That forces us to be really clear about what we want to convey. And I remember the book using this interesting analogy to illustrate this, something about a bento box.
Oh, yeah. They talk about how a single-item eel bento box is more memorable than a multi-item meal because it's focused. It's distinctive. It leaves a lasting impression.
It's about quality over quantity. A few carefully chosen ingredients, presented beautifully, can be so much more satisfying than a plate overflowing with just random dishes. And speaking of being selective, the book also reminds us to avoid vague language and double negatives. That can really muddy the waters.
Yeah, we want to be as clear and direct as possible. And instead of relying on lengthy descriptions, try using metaphors and analogies. They can make even complex ideas so much easier to grasp.
It's about painting a picture with words. And that actually connects back to something we talked about earlier, the picture superiority effect. When we can visualize information, it just becomes so much more memorable, so much more impactful.
The book gives this great example. Instead of saying, this project is like climbing a mountain, it will be challenging, but the view from the top will be worth it, you could just say, this project is Everest.
Wow, that is so much more powerful and evocative. It creates this instant image in the listener's mind.
Exactly. And lastly, the book reminds us to use visuals and white space strategically. Don't cram your slides or pages full of text. Give the information room to breathe.
It's like designing a beautiful garden. You need those plants and the empty space for it to be truly impactful.
Okay, so we've covered how to make our information output clear, concise, engaging. But what about us? How do we protect ourselves from information overload in our own lives? It just seems like it's almost impossible to escape the constant barrage of news, notifications, updates in today's world.
It's a real challenge. It is. And it's something the book addresses directly. Their solution. Information fasts. We need to schedule those regular breaks from the digital world just to reclaim our focus, allow for deeper thinking.
Information fasts. Okay. I've heard of fasting from food, but fasting from information is a new one for me. Tell me more. How does this work? Well, the book suggests starting small. Even a half-day break or daily 10-minute sessions can be incredibly beneficial. And during these information fasts, just disconnect completely from all your devices. No phone, no computer, no social media. Use this time to reflect, to do something you enjoy, or just let your mind wander.
So it's about creating space for stillness, reflection, stepping back from that constant stimulation of the digital world. It reminds me of something the author said about Isaac Newton, who apparently referred to his time during the plague as a creative vacation.
I love that. Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is step away from the noise and just let our minds rest, recharge.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools and strategies, not just for managing information better, but for thinking about my relationship with it in a more mindful way.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and hopefully helping our listeners navigate this complex information landscape we live in.
I think one of the key takeaways for me is that it's not about rejecting technology, becoming a Luddite or anything like that. It's about using technology in a way that serves us, not the other way around.
Couldn't agree more. Information is a powerful tool, and it's up to us to wield it wisely.
Well said. And on that note, to our listener, we leave you with this. What's one small change you can implement today to improve your own information management?
Maybe it's scheduling a 10-minute information fast, or defining your endpoint before you dive into your next research project, or even just creating a framework for organizing your notes. Even a small step can make a huge difference.
Remember, it's a journey, not a destination. And the rewards of managing information effectively, they're well worth the effort. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.